Hi everyone, Courtney here with Bionic Blaze Clothing, two-time cancer survivor and amputee. Doing another little drive-in chat or live drive or whatever you call these things. And I wanted to talk a bit about approaching disabled people and how you interact with them and things to not do and things you can do. And this will also involve dealing with children, kind of teach your children how to interact with people. So the main reason why I want to bring this up is because I've had a lot of really weird, awkward encounters, and I think you have to just imagine that you're just talking to a regular person, because you really are. You're talking to a regular person that's probably had a very, very different life than you, but it's not any different than encountering just a regular able-bodied person. And I say this because I've had instances where I've had someone immediately come up to me and say, "What happened to you?" And it's very jarring because you're talking about the most traumatic day of their life, most likely. So it's a little bit like, who are you? You're not even going to introduce your name. I know that you're probably dying to know the story behind it, but that's not the way that you approach random strangers. And mind you, this doesn't happen super often, but it happens often enough to where I'm just like, oh my God, this is really intense. A grown adult is coming up and doing this to me. So I think it's just one of those things where it's pretty jarring. I've been very inclined to be sarcastic and just say, "Oh, hi, what's your name?" Like, maybe you shouldn't ask about someone's most traumatic day of their life, but you know, in the moment, there's no way that I'm that like witty or sharp to be able to say that on like a whim or whatever, especially when things take you off guard. Another instance where it gets a little weird is when children ask their parents, like, what happened to their leg? And they say it really loudly, and kids are kids. They have no internal filter. There's no indoor voice. There's no library voice for children. And I always just laugh whenever kids ask because they're just curious, and that's genuinely all they are. But there are parents that will hush their children or tell them to shut up or different things like that, and that is like the worst reaction to have because they're kids, they're curious. You don't want them to think that it's a bad thing that there's different kinds of people in the world, and that's really all disabled people are, different kinds of people, and everyone's had their own experience in life, and their experience is super different than you've ever possibly experienced. So I think that it's one of those things where you need to encourage your children and have them come and ask questions. My favorite way that parents will do it is, especially if I can hear them and I just smile and I look at them and I like wave or whatever, just to make the kids feel more comfortable, is parents telling their children to come up and ask. And a lot of times parents will ask, like, is it okay if my kid asks? Which is a great way to do it as well. Because there are disabled people that might not want to even encounter the situation, and then that becomes a whole negative experience in itself because the kid goes and asks, and then the person isn't really willing or wanting to talk about it. So I think that that's probably the best way to do it, is like, is it okay if my kid asks you what happened? Just so that you can explain it to them. So there was an instance recently in Portland at the museum, the art museum, and this mom with her 5 or 6 year old kid said hi, and she loved my hair and she loved my leg and everything was so cool. And I was in my scooter, and her daughter like came over and started pushing the back of my scooter to help me. But she's a little kid, like whatever, I just kind of laughed it off. But her mom was really great about it, and she was like, you know, you don't do that. Like, honey, you don't touch other people's mobility aids. And the little girl asked why, and she's like, why? I was just helping her. And she's like, I appreciate you being super helpful, but unless people ask, you don't just start pushing them in their mobility aids. They have to ask for your help. And I thought that was really great to just explain it to her logically, because that's how kids think, is very logical. I've always been very worried about telling kids exactly how I lost my leg, just because I don't want to freak them out or anything like that. But if you tell it in a very factual way, a lot of kids are like, okay, and then they'll walk away and like completely, they might remember it later, but it's doesn't bother them at all. So I think that was a really great way to kind of just explain to kids, and don't hush them, don't make them seem like it's a bad thing. Yes, of course, there are plenty of people that don't want to talk about it, so I think that the best way is to ask the person if they can ask, if their child can ask. I did have another instance when we were in Washington. We were sitting at a pizza place, and there was a grandpa with his little, again, probably 5 or 6 year old kid, and granddaughter most likely, and she was staring at me, and I waved at her and smiled at her, and she was just like essentially begging her grandpa to ask me or to engage with me, and he was urging her to do it herself because he saw that I waved at her. So obviously I'm being like inviting, just trying to be friendly. I know the kids are super curious, and a lot of times it's a really funny interaction, and I actually really love it. It's pretty funny. And she was just dying to talk to me, but she just didn't have the courage to say anything, and she just like kept looking at me, and she at one point got really close and was sitting, like, there was a table right next to us, and she was sitting there like putting her chin on the table, and she was just staring at me, and I kept waving at her and smiling at her, and she wasn't saying anything, and they ended up leaving, and she just kept looking back at me, and Jesse and I were just like, oh my gosh, that was so like sad and adorable all at the same time, and she was dying to talk to me. So I think that's another way to do it too, is just like you're trying to encourage your children to be more outgoing and to, you know, get out of your comfort zone, and sometimes that works for them and sometimes they just don't get the courage. So I think that that's still a great way to kind of go about it. Maybe he explained later on some of the instances of it. I know that I have my nieces and nephew have asked before, and a lot of times when they initially asked, they were probably 2 or 3, and I'm just like, how am I going to explain this to a 2 or 3 year old? So I think there's definitely an age where it's hard to explain. My 3-year-old niece just asked recently why I only have one leg, or why I'm always in a wheelchair, and then when she sees me with my prosthetic, she's really confused, and she's just like trying to figure, I can tell that she's trying to figure it out in her own head. And she's a really smart kid, and she's trying to put 2 and 2 together, and she's like, Auntie Courtney, why do you, and then she'll like stutter and stutter and stutter, and she's just like, why do you only have one leg? Why is your other leg shorter? And so I have to sit there and try and think about, like, how do I explain this? I feel like I need to wait until she's older to really, I don't want her to fixate or anything like that on things, and maybe she won't, but I just said, that's how I am, and that's, you know, some people only have one leg. Auntie Courtney only has one leg. Sometimes I'm in a wheelchair, and sometimes I have my fake leg on. And she's like, oh, okay. But I know that she's still trying to make it make sense in her head, so it's pretty funny. And my nephew did the same thing when he was little, and eventually we were able to kind of talk about it once he got older and kind of understood it a bit more. But even then, it's like, you tell someone you have cancer, you know, it's a little hard to explain what that is even. So a lot of times I'll just be like, well, I had cancer. That doesn't happen to everyone. It's really doesn't happen very often, and just kind of trying to explain it in that way, trying to gauge on how much they can take in depending on their age. As far as adults come, if you're an adult and you're wondering what happened to someone, don't just walk up to them and say, what happened to you? Because that's really not a good way to approach anyone. For me personally, you could come up to me, maybe introduce yourself, give me a compliment, I don't know, like something to break the ice before you just go straight into like, hey, this is why I'm actually coming over to talk to you. And I kind of know when people come and approach me what they're going to say. Sometimes they just want to talk about the prosthetic, sometimes they actually want to ask what happened. But I think it's just one of those things where we're all human beings and we're all living our own lives, and I think it's really important to think about how you approach people. And then you'll also notice that I never say handicap. I always say disabled. Handicap is not really the best word to use for people. I know that all of the signs say handy, well, not all of them, some of them are kind of moving away from using that word. Historically, what it originates from is there were people back in the day that couldn't work for whatever reasons because they were disabled and, you know, various scenarios, and they actually might have to panhandle on the street. So it actually comes from hand and cap. So it's not really the best phrase to use, and I know it's still, sometimes I slip up and say that because I've said it for so long, but once I heard kind of the original, I feel like disabled makes more sense to say because it's very factual. Disabled is not a bad word. It describes what the person is. So I think that it's one of those things that we kind of need to move away from the phrase handicap. And so that's just a little 2 cents on that. I hope everyone has a good day. Thanks.